I wanted to make a few introductory remarks about the history of it, just to put this presentation in context. I'm sure all of you know that the 1998 North Carolina Juvenile Justice Reform Act that created the Juvenile Crime Prevention Councils required a statewide evaluation of JCPC programs, but as is often the case, the legislature didn't appropriate any funds for that statewide evaluation. Well, my longtime colleague, Dr. Mark Lipsey at Vanderbilt University, had been doing meta-analyses of effective juvenile justice system programs for many years, and he was looking for a state in which he thought he could pilot test an instrument that would enable a comparison between the most effective programs in the research and existing programs on the ground in a state. So North Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention volunteered to be that pilot state, and Dr. Lipsey, in his genius, was able to develop what's now known as the SPEP instrument, the Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol, that he was able to lay over live programs the features of the most effective programs to see how the live programs compared to the features of the very best programs for reducing recidivism. So the instrument was pilot tested here and validated, and then later in Arizona. So it was rolled out in 2006. So this, in North Carolina, then the first statewide evaluation of juvenile justice programs in history was conducted here. And now other states are attempting to validate the instrument. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. I had hoped to introduce the newest member of our SPEP team, Beth Nelson, but she is seriously ill with a food poisoning, it seems, that developed last night. But you're going to enjoy working with Beth. Many of you, I'm sure, know her as director of the Wake County Juvenile Crime Prevention Council for more than a decade, as I recall. So that was a leading county in implementing the SPEP. And Beth has a very wide background. She's actually an expert in 3 disciplines: juvenile justice, social services, and treatment of mental health issues and substance abuse. So Beth and I will be available as support persons for you as you move along with expansion of the use of the SPEP. We make a really good team, and the main reason is that she actually has implemented the SPEP and knows how to implement it, and I know how to talk about implementing it. So if you want expert advice on how to actually do it, you'll want to talk to her instead of me. But anyway, she's graciously made herself available on a limited basis to begin working immediately with you all. So we look forward to that partnership and helping you to move forward. So let me say at the outset that I owe a debt of gratitude here to Dr. Lipsey and his colleague, Dr. Chapman, for this presentation. You can see the OJJDP masthead on it. So they developed this in the OJJDP project, in which the SPEP instrument is being implemented in 8 other states at this time. So here's what I'm going to cover. I'm not going to talk at all about how the SPEP was developed. Everyone here knows that, so we don't need to spend time on that. But rather, we're going to focus on strictly implementing the SPEP instrument and featuring the various sections of it in that implementation process. So those 4 sections of the SPEP instrument are shown right here. The type of program, the quality of service, the amount of service, and the juvenile risk level. And then we'll look at some scoring examples, and lastly focus on understanding and reporting a SPEP score. and the fund that comes in with the program optimization percentage. So that's what we're going to cover. I'll begin with a brief overview of the SPEP components. Briefly, to have good outcomes, large reductions in recidivism, then the live programs must match the best practice found in the research in these 4 areas. The meta-analysis that Dr. Lipsey did of almost 600 well-designed evaluations of juvenile justice programs, as he drilled down into those programs, he found 4 common features that are associated with larger reductions in recidivism. And that's what meta-analysis involves, identifying commonalities across a large group, a large group of studies. And it's the effect size, the difference between the treatment and the control group, that is associated with larger reductions in delinquency. So these 4 factors then are associated with the larger reductions. The therapeutic programs, as opposed to punitive programs, produce larger reductions in recidivism. The quality of service delivery is important. The amount of service, like medicine, the frequency and duration, and then risk level, larger effects with higher risk juveniles. So those are the 4 sections of the SPEP instrument. Now, let's look at how the SPEP instrument presents those. There they are. There's the 4 sections of it that I just showed you. So we're going to drill down into each of these 4 sections and look at implementation issues here today. So the SPEP applies the research knowledge base that Dr. Lipsey mined with meta-analysis and provides a rating scheme for each program and applies to the individual programs, provided you have data about the services actually delivered to participating juveniles. As I said, it's been validated in Arizona as well as North Carolina and now being implemented in 8 other states: Tennessee, Florida, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So those are the other 8 states that are following suit now. Now, we're going to go through the section by section, as I said. Here are the 4 sections of the SPEP instrument. Section 1, identify juvenile justice programs. So we have to be sure that the SPEP instrument is being used for the appropriate types of programs. So we have to identify those programs to which it applies. Some programs cannot be SPEP. There's not sufficient research for those. 2 examples where Dr. Lipsey will soon have a SPEP are, first of all, programs for sexual offenders, and secondly, programs for reducing delinquency through treating substance abuse. Of course, there have been plenty of programs that have evaluated substance abuse treatment, but only for reduction in substance use. There are many fewer studies that have looked at the delinquency reduction that comes from treating substance abuse. So now there are enough studies, so he'll soon have a SPEP for each of those 2 areas. Secondly, you've got to match break the program into services and match the program services with the research-based categories, and that's in the SPEP guide. Then the data, we have to have data on the quality of services, the quantity, and risk level of the clients served. So data are critical for evaluation of programs using the SPEP. And then lastly, to score the program, entering the data into the SPEP model, which is a technical software application. So step 1, identifying the juvenile justice programs. It's important to focus on what is a program. This caused a lot of confusion at the outset because historically we've thought of programs in the field of juvenile justice in a very broad way. For example, detention has been thought of as a program. Structured day. Those are structures, as is graduated sanctions. So those are structures that may or may not have an active treatment ingredient in them. The legislature thinks of detention as treatment in a very odd sort of way. What is it? 14 detentions are permitted for a given juvenile. Is that statute still on the books, Billy? It is. It is. So the legislature thinks that repeated placement of kids in a detention facility is treatment and reduces delinquency, but it doesn't. Punitive measures do not reduce delinquency. So there could be some delinquency reduction benefit, not, I don't think, from 14 successive periods of detention, but there could be effective services delivered within a detention center that could reduce recidivism. So detention is the structure, the services are therapeutic in nature, not punitive. So that's an important distinction. The primary service, this is often difficult to isolate. The main service that a program provides, we're going to drill down into that a little bit here to get a better understanding. But briefly, it is the service that's most characteristic of the program. They might be doing several things. So it is the main service on which the most time and effort is spent. Supplemental services are those that are provided in addition to the primary service, that are linked to the primary service in the overall complement of service delivery, and hopefully complement the primary service in some way. Now, here's what a provider may look like. A program often contains a bundle. I love that concept. Well, I wanted to show this slide. A bundle of one or more services delivered by a provider at multiple sites. So here's provider X. There are 2 locations, and there are different programs in each location. There are 3 main programs in this slide. And at 4. Now there's 2 over here. So, and they may have multiple services, so it's very difficult. It's like finding a needle in a haystack to sort through those programs. I'll never forget, I wish Rich Smith were here today. He first brought my attention to the complexity of this situation way back in 2003, 2004. A decade ago when we were implementing the SPEP for the first time. Well, he'd run across a provider in a rural county that was a catch-all sort of provider. It was the only major provider in the county, so they got referrals from a wide variety of sources, not just juvenile court. But kids over time were brought there for various reasons with various different sorts of problems, because that was became a go-to provider for financial reasons and also because of the good quality work that they were doing. So he was rich. The reason he's lost a great deal of hair was he was pulling it out as he was trying to sort through. That program looked very much like this as he was doodling for me. I'll never forget the doodling that he showed me. It's very similar to this as he was trying to sort it out. But in the course of that, program improvement came out of that process as he helped that provider sort through what they were trying to provide for kids with different sorts of problems, and it helped them to inform their sources of referral that this is the range of services they're going to provide, and they're going to concentrate on these and try and do a better job with those. And the last I heard, it was quite a success story. So that is a potential benefit of working through this bundle that you might find. So the end product is, of course, matching those specific services with the 19 primary service categories attached to the SPEP. Now we go to step 2. Now that we have services matched, now we've got to identify, now we've got to match those with the research-based categories. So that involves the classification process. The specific service types found in the research. Of course, again, it applies only to therapeutic programs, and it has to be based on detailed descriptions of those programs. And we discovered early on in North Carolina and other states, they didn't have detailed descriptions of the services that programs provided. So that has proved to be a useful development. And we have to identify both the primary and supplemental services, because Dr. Lipsey's meta-analysis shows that sometimes a supplemental service will boost the effectiveness of the primary service. So you get an added increment of recidivism reduction. And of course, the service is mainly reflected as the primary service, the one that's going to be rated in the classification and the application of the SPEP. So classification proceeds in two stages. First of all, determine the broad category into which the service fits. So those 19 primary services in the SPEP guide are organized according to these broad categories. Restorative, restitution, is a main one. Counseling and its variants, individual counseling, group counseling, family counseling, and so on. Or skill building type programs, social skills, interpersonal skills, and so on. So those are the three broad categories. So that's the first task as you're looking at this primary service, see if it fits into one of those broad categories. And then determine the specific program type within that broad category, individual counseling, family counseling, and so on. So that's the important stage of initially of determining where a program, what category it falls into. So focus on the primary service as the main focus of the program, and again, in that bundle, it's hard to separate a primary service from a supplemental or secondary service. So these are four handy indicators. The most time and effort of staff, what are they spending most of their time doing? And what are the youth experiencing? Are all or most of the youth that are being served in the program receiving that particular service? Is it recognized as the dominant theme of the program? What staff were trained in, what the program advertises that it does. Other program elements support the effectiveness of the primary service. So there's another clue as to what the primary service is. Now, the supplemental is a little more difficult, less time and effort spent on it. It hopefully serves to reinforce or complement the primary service. Only some of the program clients receive it in most cases. Or it constitutes a relatively small portion of the total service time. So those are good clues for identifying the supplemental service. Not all programs get extra points for supplemental services in the absence of research. But there are several of them for which Dr. Lipsey has been able to identify supplemental services that boost the effect size a bit. Now, these are classification tools that are available. The SPEP guide, I don't see a lot of people using the SPEP guide at the outset, but it is really a handy tool. It was updated year before last, in 2013. So it is much more helpful than the initial guide that we had here in North Carolina. Having a full program profile, there are examples in the SPEP guide of a full program profile. And I know that you all have begun developing those as well. So that provides a lot of detail on going back to the JCPC planning tool that we developed here about a decade ago. It forces the issue of classifying programs along the continuum and requires a description of those programs in the process of continuum building. So it's a very valuable resource to have. You may develop, when you're going out to visit a provider that has a bundle of services, you might benefit from taking along the pre-visit checklist that's in the SPEP guide. it's real handy to help you formulate questions, to engage the provider in determining what the main services are and how many distinct programs there really are. And not only in one site, but across the state, as you have several statewide providers. Now we go to step 3. This is where it gets difficult. Assessing the quality of implementation. That has proved difficult in all states. So we have to determine the quality of implementation. This is also thought of as fidelity, program fidelity. Is it implemented as intended, as the developer intended for it to be implemented? And so that requires some really careful work. But we have some good leads now as to shortcuts in that process, some handy tools that will help with that. Quantity of services is not so difficult earlier with NC Join, now NC Allies. That's the frequency and duration of services. So that's a lot easier to manage. The risk level is also easier to manage in North Carolina than other states. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So we're looking at the second, third, and fourth sections of the SPEP in this process. Quality is the second section, quantity is the third, and risk is the fourth. Okay, the quality component. These indicators come from the meta-analysis that I'm about to show you, okay? Dr. Lipsey didn't make them up, and you see them across. When you look at major providers that have evidence-based services, like functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, they have these features, these qualities of the best programs by having a written protocol and training staff very intensively in that protocol, and monitoring the delivery of services by the newly trained staff and taking corrective actions whenever they drift from the protocol. So those are the indicators that we're talking about. And this is not equal to a full quality assurance or quality inspection system, but I know that you've been integrating the classification of and rating of programs with the quality assurance work that Denise has headed. And so it's a matter of integrating the pieces of quality assurance that you have already with the requirements of the SPEP instrument so that you can improve the quality of your scoring. So, developing this quality component requires that you know these things. Whether the agency has an explicit written protocol for delivery of that specific service. That is a treatment manual in which the staff participating in the services are familiar. Forgive me, some of this is kind of elementary, but it's important to go over it because it needs to be followed rather strictly. Whether the staff persons providing the service have received training in that specific service type. Again, coming back to that bundle situation that Rich Smith ran into, he worked with the provider in thinking about the training of the staff, their qualifications, and to guard against using staff to deliver a different type of service from where their training is. So getting away from their expertise. It's important to know the amount and recency of that training as an indicator of the quality. Whether the agency has procedures in place to monitor adherence to the protocol. Do they have a schedule of monitoring delivery of services? Or that is, are they monitoring what the staff are doing? And then do they take corrective action when there are significant departures from the protocol? Things go smoothly until human organisms get involved, right? So we're all human and we all make mistakes, and so you can easily have program drift. And so we're looking at ways of minimizing or correcting that, that program drift. And taking corrective action is a very important step in that process. Now here's a blue light telling us that something is important here, and that is in other states it was really important to integrate this quality assessment with mechanisms they already had in place to make this determination as to quality. Some states have a very well-developed quality assurance process, but not particularly advanced in most cases. Now, here's an example of what I was just saying. Here, fill in the blanks. Here's the target service. You're rating the provider. Currently, does the provider use an explicit written protocol or manual? Yes or no? Not sure, please contact Gabrielle Chapman or Beth Nelson. Does the provider have procedures in place to monitor adherence? Yes, no, yes, no. Take corrective action? Yes, no. This is going to lead to scoring, you see. Yes and no is going to lead to scoring. This particular provider was interested in the educational level of the person or persons delivering the service. So in some cases you may want to give extra credit for that advanced training. But the research is not explicit on that. The research cannot tell Dr. Lipsey whether MSW is more effective in service delivery than a person with a BA, or whether a person with a PhD is more effective. There's just not enough research on that. So that is a matter of professional judgment. Here's an example from another jurisdiction. Looking at internal fidelity monitoring, corrective action, facilitator training, treatment protocol. Facilitator turnover is an important issue for some providers. So you may want to take that into account. But what you're going to have to do to get a score on the SPEP instrument is group these responses into 3 categories: low, medium, or high. You get more points for high quality, fewer for medium, and fewer for low. But you have to quantify this thing. So it's very difficult to quantify qualitative criteria. So that's a challenge. But since the key indicators have been isolated, it is quite doable. And here's an example. For a medium rating, let's say, we're looking only at medium. For a median rating, say 4 to 6 on a scale to 10, here internal fidelity monitoring is taking place in this hypothetical program, so it gets a 1 or 2 there. There is no consistent use of corrective action with staff, a 0. Facilitator is trained specifically in the intervention, get a 1. Presence of manual or lesson plan protocols, you get 1 point there. Limited facilitator turnover, so you get 1, and no points for performance evaluations of facilitators. So the scoring of this particular program is medium. So that's how you come up with the quantitative score. On amount of services, you're looking at frequency and duration. And here's the number that we searched for so long. How many cases is the minimum that you need to rate a program? And Dr. Lipsey has settled on 10 as the minimum number. He feels comfortable with that number for classifying a program in terms of amount of service. And there are 2 indicators, the duration, which of course is the time between the first and last day that the primary service is provided. Again, when human organisms get involved, that termination date may not be recorded. Has that ever happened here in North Carolina? It happens everywhere. So it really takes a lot of monitoring to ensure that the data are clean and complete. Face-to-face contact hours, a lot of debate there. Is a phone call, can a phone call be therapeutic? And the answer has to be no. Treatment appears to be more effective with face-to-face contacts. So we cannot give providers credit for a phone call, checking on where a client is. That's more of a supervision function, right? Rather than a therapeutic setting. So, don't need to say this, but for data integrity, it's best to audit or spot check providers' reporting. So that's an ongoing process and very important in quality assurance. Now, the risk level. The great news here is that y'all have one of the best risk instruments in the United States. I say that on the basis of a recent study that the National Council on Crime and Delinquency conducted under an OJJDP grant. They compared 10 instruments in 8 states. And your instrument, your North Carolina Assessment of Risk Instrument, performed, it was is almost identical to the risk instrument that performed best in the multi-state, multi-instrument comparison. Your instrument actually came from the same source as the one that was tested in the NCCD study. In 2001, Susan Whitten and Kathy Dudley brought in the National Council on Crime and Delinquency to provide advice on instrument development. And fortunately, DJJDP followed their advice. They were the leading developer of risk and treatment needs assessment instruments at that time. So you all, the committee that Kathy and Susan formed, selected the option of 2 separate instruments, one an largely actuarial risk instrument and a separate need instrument, which is really user-friendly for the juvenile justice system process. You must assess risk immediately. When a client comes in the door, when a referral, you got to know if this kid presents a danger to himself or others. And the risk assessment can help with that, and that information can be gathered quickly. And then needs assessment is done later. As a part of comprehensive treatment plan development once risk has been assessed and managed in a public safety, from a public safety standpoint. Other states are bollocksed up with large instruments, as many as 200 items, and trying to use those as both risk and need assessment items. Some of them have a subscale that works pretty well. But what this nationwide study found, multiple instruments, multiple states, was that the actuarial instruments perform best in assessing risk, and they're most efficient in use as well. So I trust you will never depart from the use of the instruments that you have because they're the best in the field. And so that you can rely on your risk assessment instrument. Other states, before they can implement the SPEP, they've got to revise or bring in a new instrument. So they got to start at square one. So you had a considerable advantage here. The reason that that is so important is that the risk is empirically predictive of later delinquent offenses in the population on which it's being used. Those risk factors in your instrument strongly correlate with resulting recidivism. So they're very strong predictors, and they've been validated 4 times. Your instrument, your in-car, has been validated 4 times in the state of North Carolina. So you meet this criterion with flying colors. It must be administered to every juvenile receiving the service. That's to be SPEP. Now, so you've been using it for a long time with court-referred youth, and now you're moving into the JCPC served youth. And you'll be testing the use of the in-car by those service providers who rate the kids in the absence of a court intake process, you see. We'll come back to that in the discussion. after the presentation, but it's really important for every youth, absolutely essential for every youth receiving the service to be assessed for risk. And those scores have to be taken prior to the onset of service. That's also critical, so that you can determine how risk level changes in the course of service. So your instrument must be, have utility for showing high, medium, or low risk, and that's another area where other instruments fall short. They don't easily separate, don't clearly separate the population into low, medium, and high risk. So that's related to the utility of the SPEP instrument, because you want to serve higher risk kids whenever you can for larger reductions in delinquency. Now, we go to step 4, entering the data into the model. So here's where the process culminates. Entering all the data we just talked about in steps 1 through 3 into the SPEP instrument. So we've gone through each of the 4 parts, and now I'm going to show you some actual examples using a hypothetical program, I should say, for each of those sections to look up close at that allocation of points, so that you wind up with a total score for each individual service type. So here's the process. Again, to repeat, we identified the type of service that we had and put those in the proper category in the matching process, and then obtain the quality, quantity, and risk data. And now here's where we are, to enter the data, entering the data into the SPEP model to generate the score. So here's a hypothetical program we have here, the MAP program, Mentoring and the Arts. So it has 2 services. Mentoring is the primary service, and behavioral contracts is the supplemental service. Now, how does the rating process go? There you are, primary and supplemental. Okay, here on primary and supplemental services type, your SPEP guide gives you the classification of programs into 5 groups, and the top group is group 5, that shows the largest, on average, the largest reduction in delinquency, the largest effect size, in other words, the difference between treatment and control group. There's only one service to date in that 5th category, and that's cognitive behavior therapy. So it is slightly more effective than any other service type on average. But not all kids need CBT. Some youth have other problems that need to be addressed. So anyway, you must determine which group the service falls into. And then on supplemental service type, first of all, you have to determine if there is a supplemental service. And if there is, look at your SPEP guide to determine whether the program gets extra points for having that service. There is research in many cases showing a booster effect. So those programs, those primary services, get the extra 5 points. But Dr. Lipsy's made the decision that if there's not sufficient research to indicate that they should get credit for it, he gives it to them anyway. So they automatically get the 5 points if there is, for other programs for which there's no service. But you can't have the level of confidence in that you have in the situation where there's clearly research saying that a particular supplemental service gets more points. So you rely upon the SPEP guide for that information. Now, the type of service coding. Here in this particular case, this is a Group 4 service that gets 25 points. It's mentoring, and target weeks for mentoring in the SPEP are 26 weeks with 78 hours. And there is a qualifying supplemental service, behavioral contracting management. So here's how the scoring goes. Has the primary service of mentoring, supplemental of behavioral contracting, gets 25 points for mentoring because that is in group 4, the second highest group, so it gets 25 points for that. Behavioral contracting is a qualifying supplemental, another 5 points, so the total is 30 for the MAP program on type of service. Very good. Now, quality of service delivery. 5, 10, or 20 points for low, medium, or high. You know, the quantification process that I mentioned earlier. So there are 20 points on the table. And the source is your quality measure source, the data that you've gathered on that. Here's an example. Here's an example of the qualifying, the rating criteria. Delivery staff receives specific training, yes, get 1 point for that. An explicit written protocol is utilized for service, yes, you get another point for that. Quality assurance, ongoing, scheduled, or routine, yes. Acknowledges or rewards providers, therapists, that is, for service fidelity, yes. Those are the only points that it gets. They don't take corrective action on a routine basis, and they don't incorporate feedback received on training video and audio resources, so no points there. So the total is 4 on quality of service, okay? So 4 is medium, so that's going to translate into 10 points as medium, okay? So it's pretty straightforward. Once you develop those criteria and are able to apply them on site to a given program, then the total there is 10. Now, amount of service, and this is automatically generated now in North Carolina, or will be as soon as Allies is activated at the end of June. Is that the target date? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so frequency and duration of service, don't need to go over that. That is really, really straightforward. But the key thing here is that it's the proportion of kids. So a service provider overall is going to reduce delinquency more if a larger percentage of the kids they serve get the required dosage, just like taking medicine. The frequency with which you take it and the amount of the dosage. So here you have duration and contact hours. Now, the source of that is explained in the Primary and Supplemental Services Guide, but it's going to come from your providers, the data that they enter into the system. So in this case, mentoring, the target is 26 weeks with 78 target hours. So here's the possible points. Here are the percentages for duration, the percentage of kids that get the target duration. It's between 60 and 79%. So that's 6 possible points. And for contact hours, the data show between 40 and 59%. So that's 4 possible points there on contact hours. So the total is 10 on frequency and duration. Now, to risk level of youth served, 25 points on the table. Like I said, it's so important. 25 out of 100 points, 1/4, is accounted for by risk. So that's why it's so important that you have a great risk assessment instrument and that it operates as it should. So you can reliably classify programs, and because that 1/4 in points that are on the table. Now, Dr. Lipsey set this up in a clever way, again, based on what the research shows. The research shows two aspects of risk indicators in youth that are served by programs. First of all, in the first tier, allocates up to 12 points based on the percentage of juveniles in in the client group that falls in the medium or high range. That is not in the low range. So the percent greater than low risk, the percentage of kids served in the program that are not low risk, in other words. They're either medium or high risk. So there are 12 points available for that. For those programs that 95% of their clients score medium or high. So you get 12 points if it's 95%. And then the second tier allocates up to 13 points based on the percentage of juveniles that falls in the high range. That is neither low nor medium. So those that are specifically targeting high-risk kids get extra points because this is what you want them to do, except for certain JCPC programs. You want your court service programs to target higher risk. Now you have lots of data, thanks to the analysis that Megan did on serious, violent, chronic juvenile offenders, and showing that your risk instrument really classifies those subgroups well. And the kids that have serious, violent, and chronic offense histories are very high risk, and those risk factors have been identified as well as treatment needs. So you now have the research base that you needed to target services on those high-risk youth. There's very clear guidance now in your very reliable risk and treatment needs data on the development of those treatment plans. So it's quite feasible to meet these goals for the court-referred youth and to restrict those programs as much as possible to serving medium and particularly high-risk youth. Now, in this MAP program, here's our hypothetical data on the percent that scored above low, medium, or high. 87% were medium risk, so 85 to 94% is the credit that they get, so that's going to be 10 possible points. And the percent above medium, that is the percent high risk, only 4% were high risk. So where's this mark going to go? 0, right. It's 4%. There you have it. So they get 10 points for those above low risk and no points for those that are high risk. So the total is 10 points. Really straightforward, isn't it? That's the easiest part to explain and to activate if you have a really good risk instrument and are gathering good data. Now we have you didn't even know it was happening, but you have rated this MAP program. Here's the total rating that you just saw. 25 points on primary services, 5 points for supplemental, 10 points for the quality of service delivery, 6 points for duration, 4 points for contact hours, 10 points for risk level, and the total is 60 points. So that's how you come up with the total score. That's just walking through that one particular service. So that was easy, wasn't it? Relatively speaking. Now, interpreting the score. Okay, what does it mean? What does it mean for a provider? And reporting the score back to the provider. So you have the score. What's next? What do you do next? So you all worked this out years ago as to the process that you began years ago working out this process by which you're reporting scores back. Now, a couple of interesting things have happened here in North Carolina with this process that have put you in a leadership position with other states. They don't have to go through some of the pain that you went through in deciding what to do with that first score, because, Lord, it raised hackles. You know, you're scoring me. This is like an exam. You know, you said I failed. 100 points on the table, and I got 58. Are you saying my program's a failure? What does it mean? Well, one of the things that we learned in working with you all on this is that this should be viewed as a program improvement opportunity. There should be an immediate opportunity with the initial, or we might call it the baseline score that they're starting with. So it's the initial score. So you're scoring a program you found in that bundle, and so for the first time they're getting a score. And then how are we to understand that score, what it means, and what are implications for improvement? There might be some immediate opportunity for improvement of that program. You may see that they have competing supplemental services or competing primary services, and you have qualified staff for one set, not for the other. So you can make some immediate improvements there after this initial baseline score before you get your official score or your final score. So, develop a program improvement plan, even if it's informal. Let's call it a program improvement plan that we can put on paper, that we can relate to and discuss with provider on an ongoing basis, and then do a subsequent scoring. And then that becomes the next baseline as you repeat the process, you see. So we found in North Carolina that it's best to view this scoring as an iterative process. That it's new to the providers to be getting a SPEP score, and it's difficult to understand. I'll never forget, in one jurisdiction, a long-term provider leapt up out of his seat and said, "My program, I know my program's evidence-based." And I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "My recidivism rate is 14%. And I said, "I don't know if that's bad or good." The look on his face is the one that I'll never forget. He was just startled. He was so proud that he had a 19% recidivism rate. But it turned out he was serving very low-risk kids. So we have to take that into account in the scoring process as well. So it makes a difference at what position a program is in your continuum and whether you want them to be serving low-risk kids. And so that is a judgment, part of the judgment that has to be made in that placement of the program in the continuum. Now, another thing we learned here in North Carolina is to help providers that have developed homegrown programs to realize that their program may be as effective as a brand name program. It's quite possible that they could achieve that level of effectiveness. And here's what gives us that basis for optimism. In Dr. Lipsey's meta-analysis with nearly 600 studies, there were 29 studies of family therapy. Okay, so there are 29 services, the outcomes, the effect size is shown here of 29 evaluations of family therapy programs. Here's no difference. 3 made matters worse. They were all homegrown programs. All of these programs showed reductions in delinquency, and here's the median, about, what does that look like, 18%, let's say. On average, 18%. Now, out of these 29 programs, there are 8 that are either functional family therapy or multisystemic therapy. Well-known, well-recognized model programs. They deserve their reputation. Look, they never produce bad results. They always, not always, but in these studies that were included then, there are others since then, I don't know if that would still hold up, but in any event, in this data set that went up to 2001, they always showed reductions in recidivism. And several of them pretty large reductions. But look, a few homegrown programs outperformed them. And these are all well-evaluated programs. So on occasion, a homegrown program can outperform a model or blueprint program. Because sometimes the blueprint or model programs are not implemented with high fidelity. If they're implemented with high fidelity, it would be very rare. But if you can implement your homegrown program with very high fidelity, you can achieve large reductions. So our advice is, yes, by all means, use MST and MFT in your continuum. If you have a large enough number of clients at the appropriate risk level, if you can afford those services, then you should have them consider placing them in your continuum. But you should not overlook the possibility that homegrown programs can give you the same benefits at a lower cost. So that's the challenge to the local service providers to operate, design, and implement and operate their programs in accordance with the SPEP instrument so that they can potentially get comparable results. So it's within reach. That's the message here. Excellence is within reach for any program, provided that you meet the criteria that are associated with large reductions in recidivism. Now, we call that the baseline score or the basic score, the initial score, whatever you wish. That compares the program to the other intervention programs found in the research regardless of the type of program. It's meant as a reference for the expected overall recidivism reduction when compared to other program service types. Okay? So that's what the basic score means. Now, the program optimization percentage is the other thing that was developed here. In the course of sharing the SPEP scores in 05 and 06, we realized that it was very hard to get providers to understand that a score of 58 was not necessarily bad because they were serving low-risk kids, very low-risk kids. But still, they have a 58. So that makes you uncomfortable because, you know, we're trained in school. You know, 58 is an F. Any school, any standard. So you're thinking, okay, you're saying my program's really an F. No, we're not. And we developed this program optimization percentage to help understand that. And I owe Nancy Hodges credit here today for playing such a key role in the development of the program optimization percentage. And so the slides I'm about to show you, slide that she developed as we worked on that. This score indicates where the program is compared to its potential effectiveness if optimized to match the characteristics of similar programs found in the research. That doesn't mean much to you right now. It will after I show you a few more slides. Okay, all right, here we have a hypothetical program, Parent Skills Training. All right, the Parent Skills Training is a group, falls into group 3 in the SPEP guide, right? Parent Skills Training falls in group 3. So it can only get 15 of 30 potential points because group 3 programs on average show recidivism reductions at about the midpoint between low reductions and very high reductions. So that's about an average reduction. So that program can never score more than 15, okay? So there's 15 points not available to this program because of the type that it is. On supplemental service type, yeah, they had a qualifying supplemental service. They got 5 points for that. The rated quality of service was high. They got 20 points there. Amount of service, they did very poorly, 0 to 60%, only 6 points. Well, not terribly poorly, but I mean compared to the maximum potential, 6 points. So that was the only area where points dropped down there on those sections. Contact hours, same thing, 6 points. Less than 60% of the youth received the target hours of service. Risk level, the program cannot qualify for more than 5 points because the county needs this type of service in its continuum. Let's come back. Here we're talking about parenting skills training. We know that poor parenting skills is a major predictor of recidivism, or I should say a major identified treatment need. Unwillingness or unable to supervise is the language in your needs assessment instrument. And that is a clearly identified characteristic of high-risk youth. So you need parenting skills training in your continuum to help prevent further development of family supervision problems, lack of control and supervision of children. So we need family strengthening to prevent future delinquency. Because what can happen, and we see in the longitudinal research, that when a kid gets involved in delinquency, if the parents don't have good skills, delinquency makes family life worse, which makes delinquency worse, which makes it's a downward spiral. Next thing you know, you've got a crisis on your hands. So early intervention has a lot to be said for it. So you need parenting skills training in your continuum. The reality, though, is that only the low-risk youth are going to be in that type of program in this particular instance. So 5 of 25 points there. So 20 points missing. 15 up above fell off the table. Another 20 fell off here. So 100 possible minus 35 leaves you with a potential of 65. The score was 58, but the most the program could get would be 65. So the program optimization percentage is that ratio. What is the percentage of expressed here in 58 of 65 points? It's 89%. So this program is 89% as effective as it can possibly be. So that was encouraging. That was a real breakthrough coming up with this. So it's a really clear way, I think, of expressing the limitations of programs that are inherent in the level of risk of the youth they serve and their position in the continuum, serving more of a prevention or early intervention purpose rather than a rehabilitation purpose. So, with all that, all service providers and benefiting children live happily ever after. Which this entire process is carried out across counties. So thank you for your attention, and now entertain questions and discussions.